So why study Egypt? Why look at it? What is it? What is its relevance? Well, Egypt is another river valley civilization. Just like we said, we looked at the one in the Indus. We're gonna be looking at the one in Mesopotamia. We're gonna be looking at ones in China. Egypt is the other one. Egypt is one of, if not the most well-known of the river valley civilizations, and a lot of this has to do with their legacy they left behind. I mean, what's the thing if you Google ancient Egypt? What's the thing that's going to pop up in the Google image search? Just shout it out. Pyramids, yeah, it's the thing that lasts the test of time, as well as a lot of other intricate things. And Hollywood has jumped all over Egypt as an intriguing civilization by comparison. Here's one thing I want to impress upon you early on about Egypt, and that is it's in many ways extremely unique when you compare it to other ancient civilizations because it lasts such a long time. Most other civilizations, they have sort of their run, their rise, their peak, their fall, and that's it. There's not a whole lot of continuity afterwards. Maybe new dynasties come and maybe it reconstitutes itself later under different groups and leaders. But Egypt, for the most part, while they have dynasties and while they have different kind of subset kingdoms, it retains a lot of its religious, social, political, architectural structures for a long, long period of time. And what I mean by that is basically from about 3000 BCE to 332 BCE, and that's conservatively estimated. You could argue that Egyptian civilization goes on another 600 years after that. The year 332, that's the year that Alexander the Great shows up and the Macedonians and the Greeks kind of take out the leadership of Egypt, but they leave pretty much everything else in place. Much of Egypt will go on, centuries after that. The pyramids, the last of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, they still last the test of time. Unlike the Colossus of Rhodes, which fell down, and others and so forth, the pyramids are still there looking back at us. We're going to kind of give you a look here at the geography of Egypt. This is one of the ways you can analyze a civilization is by to analyze its geography. So the nucleus or foundation of Egyptian civilization is going to be the Nile River, which is also located on your mental maps. It flows from south to north, which is a little counterintuitive when it comes to maps. But what it does do is it provides a source of fresh water in the desert, the Nile River that does. And much of Egyptian civilization is going to be congregated in this lower part of the river called the Nile River Delta. That's where most of the construction is going to go on. That's where a lot of the farming is going to go on. The Nile River is very unique by river valley standards. And what I mean by that is, if you go to other river valley civilizations, Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Huanghe, the Yangtze in China, you go to the Indus in South Asia, they all have very violent flooding, unpredictability in the flooding. The Nile, totally different. It's extremely gentle. It's also very predictable. You can make human structures to not only capture and direct that water, but you can, not have it be damaged by the regularity of the flooding. And what that means is that things like transportation and irrigation are going to be very well coordinated aspects of Egyptian civilization. Remember irrigation, that term, if you're not familiar with it, it means the capturing and directing of water for the purpose of growing crops. For my money, Egypt is the best civilization that I think has the odds of succeeding if you were placing bets early on. If you were placing bets on which ancient river valley civilization would succeed, it would probably be a good idea to bet on Egypt. And let me present to you why I think that. Number one, it has a robust river. The Nile River, which deposits fresh water, necessary. It also floods out in many, many different directions in the Delta region. But critically, it has natural protective barriers. Most notably, To the east, there's desert, the Sinai Desert, which is also very mountainous. It's very difficult for outside armies or marauding invaders to pass. To the west, there's the Libyan Desert, and then further beyond that, the Sahara Desert. Going to be virtually impossible for armies to sweep in from that side. To the south, while there are other peoples and civilizations to the south, it's beyond the Nile River, which has a series of falls in the river, which are called cataracts, which you can't traverse very easily. So the Egyptians can't just do a lazy float, because number one, it's against the current because it flows from south to north. Number two, you have the various cataracts which disrupt the flow of vessels up the river. So it's kind of like the perfect civilization incubator that allows people and complex societies and systems of government to get off the ground without having to deal with all of the, conflict from outside people. And Egypt is going to do that in a really big way. Just for the terminology here, Egypt is divided originally into two kingdoms, what's called the upper and the lower. I know that's kind of counterintuitive because it's actually upper means the south because the river flows from south to north, so it's upriver. And down or lower is going to be the lower kingdom in the north. And they eventually merged together to form the basis for this civilization, around 3000 BCE or so. So I'm going to give you a kind of 35,000-foot overview of the chronological rule of Egyptian civilization. I'm going to leave this slide up. It's by far the wordiest slide. But it's going to show you how different groups are, how Egyptian history is divided up into different periods of rule. Even though the religion, the society, the system of rule was very much largely in place. The first of these is called the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom is, as the name suggests, the oldest. Critically, this is when the most famous aspect to Egyptian society was constructed, most notably the pyramids. Let you get a few things down. The pyramids are going to be built during the Old Kingdom. They're going to be the thing that lasts the test of time. And it's also going to be during the Old Kingdom that the power of the pharaohs, the god, king, emperor, ruler, that's going to kind of centralize power over the Egyptian government, is going to build that power. And here's what's unique about Egyptian civilization. If you look at other civilization, oftentimes they're very fragmented. They have many different groups vying for power. Sometimes you get a really strong, powerful ruler comes to power, unifies a vast stretch of land. Other times it kind of fragments out, smaller kingdoms take over, maybe they're squabbling amongst generals or local principalities. In Egypt, that really doesn't happen. Most of the power gets concentrated in the central authority of the pharaoh and their administration. That's going to be really unique by ancient world standards, that you can have one human being wielding that much power that everybody kind of agrees with and falls in line with. The Old Kingdom doesn't last forever. From about 2600 to 2100 BCE, it thrives, but a new set of rulers come to power, still much of Egyptian civilization still in place, called the Middle Kingdom, for about 500 years, 400 years. Continues to develop agriculture and trade, but it ultimately falls due to internal corruption, but outside invaders. A lot of those geographic boundaries, like desert to the east and west, don't hold. Outsiders from the Middle East will sweep in and temporarily overtake the Middle Kingdom, but Egyptian civilization continues to go on in a powerful and meaningful way. Egypt reaches its peak under what would be called the New Kingdom. This is sort of peak Egypt at this point. From about 1500 BCE to 1000 BCE, not only are the pharaohs very, very powerful, but they also become an expansionist state. They go out and they conquer other people. So they're not just isolated to that really great civilization foundation, the Nile River Delta and the Mediterranean and so forth, but they go out and they conquer. Let me show you a picture of that here. This is the New Kingdom at its peak. If you look, you have the Nile River Delta, the old nucleus of the civilization, but they expand to the south. They take over a competing kingdom to the south called the Kingdom of Kush, and they're also going to be influenced by the Egyptians. They're going to build pyramids of their own that have since been excavated, and you see some real cultural diffusion going on there. They take over some land to the west. They move into what, in the Christian era, would become known as the Holy Lands. It would be modern-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Transjordan, the Sinai Desert, the areas that the ancient Israelites, for those of you who come from a Christian background, thinking of biblical times, it would have been right around the time of, like, say, King David's rule, that the new kingdom in Egypt is reaching its peak. And they're going to spread down and establish trade networks with traders along the Red Sea and down into the Gulf of Aden, all the way almost to the Arabian Sea. So this is going to be a real incredible span of territory that's going to be taken in. There's also what's called the late period, which is kind of like the New Kingdom light. The New Kingdom in decline, the New Kingdom, its best days are behind it, where a lot of the ruler systems of religion are still in place, but for the most part, it's seeing its expansion regress. They're losing territory. They're not as powerful as they once were. This ultimately comes to an end in 332 when the Macedonians and the Greeks show up under Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, he's a figure we're going to talk about when we talk about ancient Greece and later on ancient Rome. But basically, he's an insanely productive conqueror who takes over much of Greece, and then he takes over Egypt, and then he takes over much of the Middle East. Pretty much all of the known world. His armies get as far as modern-day India, and he does all of this in about a span of 10 years. And by the age of 33, he's conquered the entire known world, but mysteriously dies. And more on Alexander the Great when we get to that. But he's just simply going to replace the leadership in Egypt. He's going to install some Greek rulers there, and they're going to kind of pick up Egyptian culture, and they're going to become the new pharaohs. It's going to be called the Ptolemaic dynasty. You don't need to know that. But that's what he does. And then you have what's called the Greek and Roman period. For another, I guess you could say, 600 years. It lasts all the way to the 390s CE, where the Greeks and the Romans will show up, but Egyptian culture still goes on as normal. Egyptian religion goes on. I mean, later on, towards the end, when Christianity is implanting itself in Egyptian society, they'll kind of get rid of the religious beliefs and Christianity will grow, and then later Islam comes along. But here's one thing I want to impress upon you. This is one of these things that it does it for me when I think about history. When Julius Caesar, the Roman general, shows up in Egypt around 40 BCE, okay? 40 years before the Christian era, Julius Caesar. You guys have heard of him at least. When he shows up to meet with the Egyptian ruler Cleopatra, who's actually was installed by Alexander the Great's several centuries earlier, when he looks out at the landscape in Egypt, and he's looking at the pyramids, and he's looking at the Sphinx, the pyramids are as old to Caesar as Caesar and the Romans are to us today. In fact, they're actually older. They're actually older. That's how long Egypt had been an implanted civilization, meaning the pyramids, this grandiose things, which are the largest structures in the world until the Eiffel Tower was built in the 1880s in Paris. Those were as old to Caesar as Caesar and the Romans are to us. That, to me, is incredible, and it's a real testament to the staying power of ancient Egypt. When it comes to trade, the Egyptians, they trade with other civilizations. They export valuable commodities like gold and linen and papyrus and pottery. We know this because you can find this excavated in various civilizations. They have a pretty strong relationship with the kingdom to the south, or a region known as Nubia. It becomes the kingdom of Kush later on. They have really strong relationships with the people of the Eastern Mediterranean, which, going back to like biblical times, it would be the ancient Israelites, the kingdom of Israel and Judah, also the Phoenicians, the Philistines, and several other groups that dominate that area. They'll trade with the Assyrians, although the Assyrians will actually conquer parts of Egypt, but other later Mesopotamian rulers. They'll have a relationship with the ancient Greece. There's a powerful civilization in the island of Crete called the Minoans. They're going to kind of lay the foundation for the Greek city-states to come later on. So Egypt has a strong maritime relationship. All of these goods are important for the Egyptians, but the single most important economic good that they're going to trade, it's going to be like their hallmark, the thing that people look to Egypt for. When the Romans show up trying to conquer it, they're thinking about this. And that is, Egypt grows an insane amount of wheat. Egypt is the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. If the Roman army is marching somewhere, or the Greeks under Alexander the Great, or whoever else comes along after, they're probably eating bread grown in the Nile River, or wheat that was grown in the Nile River Delta. When you control the grain supply, you control, essentially it's like controlling the oil supply of today, because it allows armies to march, it allows you to project force, it allows you to feed your people, it allows you to put down rebellions. You pretty much control the pulse of Mediterranean society, and Egypt has that. Here's some imagery. Remember the kind of general rule in a pre-modern world, a world before fossil fuels and railroads and modern heavy equipment. It's always easier to float than it is to move something on land. And the Egyptians are going to do that with the Nile River Delta. They're going to pack down barges with wheat, and they're going to send it throughout the whole Mediterranean world. Social structure. Remember I said an insane amount of power was concentrated in one central ruler that was able to pass their power on generation after generation, and that's not always the case in the ancient world, because usually really powerful guy dies and then there's fighting amongst the kids or the generals, and that rule doesn't get transmitted reliably. They actually do this in Egypt. The pharaoh is able to kind of transfer power really well. They have government officials, nobles, and priests that kind of oversee a lot of the social and governmental processes, obviously. During the New Kingdom, for instance, soldiers are going to be a big component to social status, because they're going to go out and conquer different areas. Scribes, people who write and keep records. Merchants, people who trade. Craftspeople are going to be really important, because craftspeople are going to be instrumental in massive building projects, not just the pyramid, but also monuments and palaces and other temples and so forth. Farmers and slaves. And by the way, if you're a farmer, you also could be simultaneously a craftsperson, or at least a laborer who works with craftspeople, because while you may farm part of the year, during the flooding months, when the Nile River is flooding in that gentle, predictable fashion, you can get recruited into building projects, because the pharaoh's not going to have you just sitting around eating up the grain stores. They're going to insist that you go to work. Pyramids and other structures. The pyramids were tombs for the rulers. They're mostly built by farmers during flooding seasons, as I just mentioned, and they're built during the Old Kingdom. Again, this great structure is actually part of the oldest period in Egyptian history. When you think pyramids now, think 2500 BCE. That's the century that they're going to be constructed, around that time. The Great Pyramid at Giza, the one that you probably find in the first Google image search of ancient Egypt. Built from about 2580 BCE to about 2560 BCE, I think this is a remarkable accomplishment, because not only is it an amazing structure that lasts the test of time, but that incredibly amazing structure is built in only a 20-year period. When you compare it to, say, the great cathedrals of Europe in places like England and Spain and France and Germany, during the Middle Ages, during the European Middle Ages, thousands of years later, it would take 40, 50 years to build a cathedral. Even then, it might not be fully outfitted and ornate. So you could be watching the scaffolding and the bricks be laid for a cathedral in Europe as a child. And then, should you be lucky enough to live to like the age of 60 as an elderly person, you could look at the same project being constructed. The Egyptians build the Great Pyramid in basically a generation. Maybe not every aspect to it, but much of it is going to be completed. It's going to be built at the tomb of the pharaoh Khufu, and it's the tallest structure in the world until the Eiffel Tower is completed in the 1880s. All right, here's our first task. I'm going to turn off the screenshot here.